If you think life has been unfair to you, then you've never been in Quinn's shoes. Her life wasn't a book. It was a series of unfortunate events, and the latest chapter was a cruel joke. The eviction notice, taped to the door of her apartment, was an unforgiving final act. It felt like her last hope had just been thrown out with the trash. The flimsy paper crinkled in her trembling hand, each word a sharp stab to her chest. Pay up or get out. It wasn't a request, it was an order. Quinn had spent the last 2 years running on empty, taking every shift at the copper penny she could get, surviving on stale coffee and 3 hours of sleep. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. The bills piled up like gravestones, each one a memory of a promise she couldn't keep. A single, defeated sob escaped her lips, a small, quiet sound swallowed by the oppressive silence of the hallway. She quickly wiped the tear away. She had learned long ago that tears didn't fix a damn thing. What she needed was money. What she needed was a miracle. But in this world, miracles didn't exist for people like her. With her shoulders squared and her jaw set, she walked back into her small apartment, the heavy silence her only companion. She had to keep working. She had to pretend everything was fine. Because in her life, a person's struggles were their own private business, and the only person who could save her was herself. Chapter 1. The night at the Copper Penny hummed with the predictable chaos of a Friday. The air was thick with the scent of stale beer, fried onions, and a sticky sweetness that clung to everything. Music thumped from the old jukebox in the corner, a soundtrack of forgotten 90s hits that no one ever really listened to, but that everyone expected. Quinn moved through it all on autopilot, her body a well-oiled machine that had memorized every motion. Grabbing a clean glass, pulling a draft lever, wiping down the sticky bar top. Her mind, however, was a frantic whirlwind of numbers and dates. 3 days left. The thought was a physical weight on her shoulders, a stone she carried with every step. Her back ached, her feet throbbed, and her smile felt like it was painted on with a cheap brush. The eviction notice, crumpled and tucked into her pocket, was a constant, itchy reminder. She had to stay afloat. She had to. Another round, Quinn's. A man with a booming laugh yelled from the other end of the bar. He was a regular, a construction worker named Frank, and he was the kind of person who made her job bearable. He knew her name, remembered her birthday, and always left a generous tip. She gave him a tired but genuine smile and went to fill his order. She was so engrossed in her internal math problems that she almost didn't notice him at first. He was sitting in the corner booth, the one with the tattered red vinyl that no one ever chose. He didn't look like the kind of man who belonged in a place like the Copper Penny. The other patrons were a mix of working-class locals, students from the nearby community college, and a few retirees who came in for cheap beer and good conversation. This man, however, had an aura of quiet power that made him stand out. His jacket looked like it cost more than her entire rent, and his shoes were so polished you could see your reflection in them. He wasn't loud or flashy. He simply existed, a still point in the storm of the bar. He ordered a sparkling water with a lime wedge, a strange order for a place that specialized in draft beer, and watched her. It wasn't a creepy stare. It was a focused, almost clinical observation. He never smiled or tried to get her attention. He just watched, a silent, enigmatic presence. He became a regular after that. Every night, around 8:30, he would walk in and sit in the corner booth. He would order his sparkling water, pull out a sleek tablet, and just watch. Quinn named him the Phantom, a little joke she had with her co-worker, a kind, older woman named Barb who had seen it all. "He's got it bad for you, honey," Barb had said one night, winking as she polished a glass. Quinn had snorted. "Please, Barb. He's just waiting for the right moment to ask me for a loan." Barb had chuckled. "Trust me, that man doesn't need a loan. He's got that I own the bank and the land it's built on look." The truth was, the more he came in, the less creepy it felt and the more comforting it became. In a life where everything felt like it was on the verge of falling apart, his nightly presence became a small, stable ritual. He was a constant. The week before her eviction deadline was a blur of exhaustion. Quinn was working double shifts, her eyes heavy and her movements sluggish. Her mind was a constant loop of fear. She went to bed thinking about the money, woke up thinking about it, and spent every waking moment trying to figure out how to bridge the impossible gap. On the fifth day, she was so tired she accidentally spilled a tray of drinks all over a table of rowdy college kids. They all burst into laughter, and Quinn felt a hot, humiliating wave of tears well up in her eyes. It was a stupid, small thing, but in that moment, it felt like the final straw. She apologized profusely, her voice shaking, as Barb rushed over with a handful of towels. "You okay, sweetie?" Barb whispered, giving her a sympathetic look. Quinn just nodded, unable to speak. She didn't look at the corner booth, but she felt his gaze on her, an unusual weight that made her skin tingle. She kept her head down for the rest of the night, ignoring him, ignoring everyone. 2 days later, she woke up to the sound of her phone's notification bell. It was an email from her landlord, a message she had been dreading. Her stomach lurched. She opened it, bracing herself for another threat, another reminder of her failure. But the words on the screen made no sense. "Dear Ms. Hayes, this email serves as confirmation that your rent for the month of July has been paid in full, with a small surplus to be applied to next month's rent. Thank you. Michael Gentry, landlord." Quinn read it again, then again, her heart hammering against her ribs. Paid? It had to be a mistake. She checked her bank account. Her balance was the same as it had been, a pathetic number that hadn't changed in weeks. She frantically called her landlord, her hands shaking as she dialed. "Mr. Gentry," she said when he picked up. "This is Quinn Hayes from apartment 4B. I think there's been a mistake. You sent me an email saying my rent was paid." The landlord's voice was gruff, but strangely pleasant. "No mistake, Miss Hayes. A benefactor paid your rent for you. They wish to remain anonymous." He hung up, leaving Quinn standing in the middle of her tiny apartment, a wave of relief so powerful it almost knocked her off her feet. She was saved. She didn't have to worry about the eviction notice. She could breathe again. But a single question echoed in her mind. Who? Her first thought was her grandmother, but she knew that was impossible. Her grandmother was on a fixed income and was barely scraping by herself. She went through her list of friends and coworkers, but none of them had that kind of money. The only person she could think of was the Phantom, the man in the corner booth. The idea was crazy. Why would a stranger, a man who had never spoken a word to her, do something like that? It didn't make sense. And yet, she couldn't shake the thought. The way he had watched her, the day she had spilled the drinks, the quiet intensity of his gaze, it all came rushing back to her. She had a feeling, a deep, unexplainable certainty, that he was the one. That night at the Copper Penny, Quinn felt like a completely different person. She laughed with her customers, danced to the music, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't have to worry. Her eyes were constantly drawn to the corner booth. He was there, as always, sipping his sparkling water and watching her. She felt a new emotion, a strange mix of gratitude and wonder. He wasn't just a mysterious regular anymore. He was a silent benefactor, a guardian angel who had saved her from falling into an abyss. She waited for a break, her heart thumping in her chest. She had to thank him. She had to know. She walked over to his booth, her hands clutched nervously behind her back. Excuse me," she said, her voice a little shaky. He looked up from his tablet, his eyes a deep, warm brown that held an intelligence she hadn't noticed before. He raised an eyebrow slightly, a small hint of genuine confusion on his face. "Yes?" he asked, his voice a low, smooth rumble. "Is there something I can get for you?" "No, it's not that," she said, her hands twisting nervously. I just wanted to say thank you." He feigned surprise perfectly, a small, subtle lift of his shoulders. "For what?" he asked, his confusion seeming real enough to make her doubt her instincts. "I don't believe we've ever spoken." "I know," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper so only he could hear. "It's about my rent. I know it was you. My landlord said a benefactor paid it in cash, and you're the only person I can think of who would do something so kind." A slow, wry smile touched his lips. "I'm sorry, but you have me confused with someone else. I've only ever ordered a sparkling water here." Quinn's heart sank, a wave of disappointment washing over her. She had been so certain. "Oh," she said, the word a small, deflating puff of air. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have assumed. It's a crazy coincidence." She started to back away, her shoulders slumping in defeat, but he stopped her. "Hold on," he said, his voice now soft and low, a secret between the two of them. She looked back at him, and his eyes held a tenderness that made her breath catch. He sighed, a faint smile on his lips. "You really are persistent, aren't you?" He leaned in slightly. "You're right. It was me, and I'm not going to lie and say it was a mistake." He set his tablet down, his eyes softening. "You're very welcome," he said. "I don't know why you did it," she said, the words tumbling out. "But you saved me. You really did." He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through her. It was a fleeting moment, but it felt like a promise of something more. "I just wanted to help," he said, his voice softer now. "I'm Damon, by the way." "Quinn," she said, her heart fluttering. That night, she went home and slept soundly for the first time in months. She had a new feeling in her chest, a fragile, hopeful warmth that had replaced the cold, hard lump of despair. She was no longer just a barmaid fighting to survive. She was a woman who had been seen and saved by a stranger, and she had a feeling that this was just the beginning. The next day, he would come back, and she would have to find out why. She didn't know what this meant, but for the first time, she was excited to find out. The following day, when she walked into the bar, her heart fluttered with a nervous anticipation she hadn't felt in ages. She was almost certain he would be there. He wasn't. She tried to tell herself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he had been a kind man who had done a good deed and moved on. The thought was deflating, but she tried to push it out of her mind. She worked her shift, trying to ignore the empty corner booth, a painful reminder of her fleeting hope. As she was about to leave, she found a small note tucked into her tip jar. It was from him. "You're not a person who can be easily forgotten." It was a simple, short note, but it felt like a 100-page letter. It was an unspoken promise, a whisper that he was still there, watching over her. She folded the note carefully and tucked it into her pocket. She had a feeling that her life, as she knew it, won't be the same after. Chapter 2. The week following the discovery of her mysterious benefactor was a strange one for Quinn. The knot of tension that had lived in her stomach for months had finally unraveled. She still worked the same shifts, pulled the same levers, and wiped down the same sticky bar, but her steps were lighter. The constant, gnawing fear had been replaced by a fragile but persistent hope. And that hope had a name: Damon. He came in every night, just as before, but the dynamic had shifted completely. He still sat in his corner booth, but now when she passed by, he would offer a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Sometimes he'd lift his sparkling water in a silent toast, and a private, knowing look would pass between them. It was a secret they shared, a quiet understanding that no one else in the loud, boisterous bar could ever grasp. One Thursday evening, the bar was quieter than usual, a gentle lull before the weekend storm. Quinn was wiping down the counter, her mind wandering, when she looked up and saw Damon standing at the bar instead of in his usual booth. Her heart did a little flutter kick against her ribs. "A change of scenery?" she asked, trying to sound cool and nonchalant. He gave a soft chuckle that was like a low vibration, both soothing and thrilling. "I figured it was time," he said, his voice a warm rumble. "I've been watching you for weeks, and I feel like I know every single one of your moves. Your smile when a customer tells a terrible joke, the way you chew on your lip when you're thinking, the little sigh you give at the end of a long shift." He said it all so casually, as if he were just describing the weather, but his words sent a jolt of heat through her. He really had been watching. It wasn't just a fantasy. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. He slid it across the bar to her. "This is my number," he said. "I'd love for you to use it. When you're not working, of course." Quinn's mind went blank. Her fingers brushed against the paper. A simple white slip with a series of numbers and a name written in a clean, elegant hand. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for and secretly terrified of. She had just a split second to decide. Her past, filled with pain and betrayal, screamed at her to run. Her present, a life of quiet desperation, begged her to take a chance. Her mouth opened, and without a single thought, the word tumbled out. Okay. The smile he gave her was brilliant, a genuine flash of pure joy that lit up his eyes. He raised his hand in a silent salute, gave a quick nod, and walked out the door, leaving her standing there with her heart pounding in her chest, and a piece of paper that felt like a secret treasure. She stared at the number for what felt like forever, her co-worker Barb giving her a knowing look from across the bar. "What are you waiting for, sweetie?" Barb said with a grin. "Call him." Quinn felt a blush creep up her neck. I don't know," she stammered. "What if it's a mistake?" Barb just laughed. "A mistake? That's not a mistake. That's a man who has clearly been waiting for you to be ready to see him. Now go on, text him." She didn't text him that night. She waited until the next morning, her heart in her throat. She sent a simple message. "Hi, it's Quinn." Her phone felt heavy in her hand as she waited, but it wasn't long before a reply came through. "I know. I'm glad you reached out." It was simple, perfect, and it was the start of everything. Their first date wasn't dinner at some fancy, stuffy restaurant. It was a picnic. He had picked her up in a sleek, black car, and instead of taking her to some extravagant place, he drove her to a quiet park just outside of the city. He had laid out a blanket and a wicker basket filled with a feast of sandwiches, fruit, and even a bottle of sparkling lemonade that she loved. Quinn, for the life of her, couldn't figure out how he knew that. She loved sparkling lemonade, but it was a little, silly thing that she had never told anyone before. They sat on the blanket in the dappled sunlight, surrounded by the quiet hum of the trees and the distant chirping of birds. He was nothing like she expected and everything she never knew she needed. He didn't brag about his money or his possessions. He asked her questions, and he listened, really listened, to her answers. He asked about her dreams, her fears, the stories behind the little scars on her knuckles. He was patient and gentle, and he made her feel like she was the only person in the world who mattered. "You really listen," she said, a little surprised. He chuckled, the sound deep and warm. "It's my job. As a CEO, you have to. You have to know what your team needs, what they're not saying out loud. Reading people is a good skill to have, both in the boardroom and in life." He paused, a strange, knowing look in his eyes. "It's something you get good at when your whole world depends on it." She smiled. "I guess it is. But you don't have to do that with me. I'm just me." "That's the whole point, Quinn," he said, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. "I've been waiting for you to be just you." The moment was so honest, so pure, that it took her breath away. She had spent so long hiding, so long pretending she was okay, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen. He wasn't just looking at her, he was seeing her. And it was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Over the next few weeks, their dates were a beautiful, sweet blur. He didn't take her to fancy places again. He took her to a quiet art gallery she had always wanted to visit, but never had the time. He took her to a small, independent bookstore where he somehow managed to find a rare edition of her favorite book from her childhood. It was uncanny. It was as if he had a secret guidebook to her life. She brought it up one night as they were sitting on a bench in the park, eating ice cream cones. She had a streak of chocolate on her cheek, and she was giggling at a terrible joke he had just told. "Okay, I have to ask," she said, wiping the chocolate away with the back of her hand. "How do you know these things? The lemonade, the bookstore, the little details." He just smiled, a small, knowing look in his eyes. "I'm a good listener," he said simply. "Good listener or psychic," she teased, and they both laughed. The moment was so light, so full of an easy, comfortable joy, that she didn't question it further. She didn't want to ruin the magic. But the magic was real, and it was growing every day. He made her feel safe. He made her feel cherished. He made her feel like a person, not a problem. He was everything she had been missing, and she found herself falling for him, hard and fast. The pain of her past, the memories of loss and desperation, began to feel a little less sharp. The darkness in her life was being pushed back by the warmth of his presence. One night, as he walked her to her door, she hesitated before going inside. The air was cool and still, and the streetlights cast a soft, romantic glow on the sidewalk. She looked up at him, her heart in her eyes. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He just looked at her, his eyes filled with a tenderness so profound it made her want to cry. He gently reached for her hand and pulled her closer, his other hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. He didn't rush. He didn't press. He just waited, giving her all the time in the world to make her choice. And in that moment, she realized she was ready. She leaned in, closing the small gap between them, and their lips met. It was a soft, gentle kiss at first, full of a quiet understanding and a long-held promise. And then it deepened, becoming a fierce, passionate declaration of everything they had been feeling. It was a kiss that sealed their connection, a promise that this was real, that this was true. She had given him her heart, and she knew, with every fiber of her being, that it was safe with him. And she had a feeling that he had a few more secrets for her to uncover. Chapter 3. The months that followed were a beautiful, sweet blur. Quinn felt as though she was walking in a dream, a perfect world painted in soft pastels and the scent of damp earth after a light rain. Her life had completely changed. A few days after their first kiss, Damon had gently, but firmly, suggested she quit her job at the Copper Penny. He didn't want to see her exhausted anymore, to watch her pour herself into a job that gave her nothing back. At first, she had argued, a stubborn pride rising in her chest. I can't just quit. I have to work, she had insisted. He had just smiled, that warm, tender smile of his, cupping her face with his hands. I know you can do anything, Quinn, but you shouldn't have to struggle. I want you to have time for yourself, to rest, to breathe. His words were a balm to her weary soul, a silent promise that he would take care of her. He had already paid her rent for a year. Now he was offering her the one thing she couldn't buy, peace of mind. And so she had quit. It felt strange at first, a foreign feeling of freedom that was both exhilarating and a little terrifying. She found herself with empty hours she didn't know how to fill. She started reading for pleasure again, taking long walks in the park, and spending quiet afternoons just sitting on her couch, a cup of tea in her hands, watching the world go by. The physical ache in her feet and the constant exhaustion in her bones were replaced by a quiet calm she hadn't felt in years. Her entire existence had been centered on survival, and now, thanks to him, it was centered on living. Damon had become the very air she breathed, a constant, comforting presence that filled the empty spaces in her life. Their love had settled into a rhythm that was both exhilarating and profoundly peaceful. The simple quiet between them was its own kind of symphony, and she could spend hours with him just sitting in comfortable silence, their hands intertwined, feeling more at home than she ever had before. He had a way of looking at her that made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. His gaze was steady and unwavering, and it was in those moments that she felt the deepest connection. Every single moment with him felt like a gift. But even gifts can have a few loose threads. The first crack was small, so small she almost missed it. They were at a bookstore, a big, bustling one downtown with towering shelves and a scent of old paper that she loved. She was reaching for a book on a high shelf when her hand slipped, and the book, a heavy hardcover, went tumbling toward the floor. In a blink, Damon was there. He moved so fast it was like the air around him had been warped. 1 second he was a few feet away, admiring a graphic novel. The next, his hand was out, catching the heavy book a mere inch from the floor. His movements so smooth and effortless that it was as if he'd been doing it his whole life. Quinn's eyes went wide. Whoa, she breathed out, her heart hammering in her chest. That was fast. He just laughed, a low, easy sound. My reflexes are pretty good, he said, a playful smile on his lips. He handed her the book, and she felt a strange jolt of heat as their fingers brushed. It was a funny moment, a strange little detail she filed away and immediately dismissed. It was just good reflexes, after all. The second crack was a bit bigger. They were at a crowded shopping mall, doing some light window shopping. The place was a sea of people, and Quinn, who was a little bit claustrophobic, was starting to get anxious. She felt her chest tighten, and she had to stop to take a deep breath. She looked around, and for a split second, she couldn't see Damon. Her heart gave a panicked lurch. Then, she felt a soft hand on her back and heard his voice, a calming rumble right behind her ear. "Easy," he whispered. "I've got you." She jumped, startled. "Where did you even come from?" she said, her voice a little breathless. "I just saw you a second ago on the other side of that kiosk." He just smiled, a hint of something unreadable in his eyes. "I never left. I was right here the whole time." He pulled her closer to him, his arm a strong, steady presence around her waist, and she felt her anxiety melt away. It was a little unsettling, but his presence was so comforting that she decided to let it go. It was probably just the stress of the crowd, making her mind play tricks. The cracks, however, started to grow. One Sunday morning, she was helping him organize his garage. He was moving a large, solid oak table, the kind that probably weighed 100 pounds. She went to help him lift it, and he just smiled, a small, knowing look in his eyes. He reached down and with a single hand lifted the entire table and moved it a good 2 feet to the side. He didn't strain, didn't grunt, he just did it, as if he were moving a piece of cardboard. Quinn's jaw dropped. "What was that?" she exclaimed, her eyes wide. He looked at the table, then at her, and gave a small shrug. "What? It's not that heavy." "Not that heavy," she said, her voice a little high. "It's a solid oak table, Damon. You just moved it with one hand. That's not normal." He just laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that filled the garage. "I told you I'm strong," he said playfully, flexing his bicep. "It comes from working out." He said it with a wink, and she felt herself smile, even though her brain was screaming at her to question him more. It was so easy to get caught up in his charm, to let the strange things slide. But the most unsettling thing happened one night when they were out for dinner. A drunk man at the table next to them was being loud and rude, saying some terrible things to his waitress. Quinn, who had dealt with rude customers for years, just sighed and tried to ignore it, but Damon's entire body went rigid beside her. His jaw clenched, and for a brief, terrifying second, his eyes, those warm brown eyes she had grown to love, flashed a brilliant, fiery gold. It was a fleeting image, a brief flicker of a fire behind his gaze, but it was there. She was so shocked she almost stopped breathing. The moment passed as quickly as it came. He took a deep breath, and the golden light faded. He was back to being the calm, handsome man she knew. He didn't say anything about it, and neither did she. But the image of that golden fire stayed with her, a cold stone of unease in her stomach. The next day, she went to her best friend, Melissa, for advice. Melissa had been her friend since college, a fiery, no-nonsense woman who worked as a photographer and didn't believe in mincing words. Quinn told her about the unnatural speed, the sudden appearances, the shocking strength, and the flash of gold in his eyes. Melissa listened, her arms crossed, her expression a mix of amusement and genuine concern. When Quinn was done, Melissa leaned back in her chair and just stared at her. "So," Melissa said slowly, a small smile playing on her lips, "your new boyfriend is a billionaire who is freakishly strong and fast, can pop in and out of a crowd, and has eyes that glow like a fire when he's mad." Quinn, you know what that sounds like, right? Quinn felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. "What?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Melissa leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with laughter. "It sounds like you're dating a vampire." Quinn burst into laughter, a loud, startled sound that was more of a nervous release than a genuine laugh. "A vampire? Don't be ridiculous." Melissa just shrugged. "Okay, fine. If he's not a vampire, then he's a supernatural billionaire of some kind. Maybe a werewolf? They get pretty fast and strong, right? And I think their eyes change colors." The joke landed, and they both laughed, but as the laughter faded, Melissa's words hung in the air, a heavy truth that Quinn couldn't shake. She had dismissed every oddity, laughed off every strange moment, and pushed aside every fear. But now all the pieces were clicking into place, and the picture they were painting was a terrifying one. Her perfect, wonderful boyfriend was hiding a secret, a very big, very unnatural secret. And for the first time in her life, the fear of the unknown was back, a cold, hard lump in her stomach that she couldn't wish away. Chapter 4. The words of her best friend, Melissa, echoed in Quinn's mind as she walked home. Maybe a werewolf? They get pretty fast and strong, right? And I think their eyes change colors. Quinn couldn't help but let out a small, quiet laugh. The sound was a brittle, hollow echo on the dark, quiet street. A werewolf. The thought was so absurd she almost stumbled. Werewolves and vampires were things you read about in books, creatures in fantasy movies and television shows. They didn't exist in the real world. Not in her world, anyway. Her life was grounded in cold, hard reality. Bills, long hours, and the constant struggle to get by. There was no room for supernatural creatures. She tucked her hands into the pockets of her jacket, a sense of calm settling over her. The night was still and quiet, the air cool on her cheeks. She was walking a familiar path, down a narrow alleyway she had taken 100 times before because it was the fastest way home. She wasn't afraid. She was a city girl, after all. She knew how to be careful, how to blend into the shadows, how to get from point A to point B without any trouble. Melissa's joke was just that, a joke. Her boyfriend was just a man. A wonderful, kind, generous man who was freakishly strong and fast, and whose eyes sometimes glowed with a fire that wasn't of this world. It was nothing. Nothing at all. Her mind was so consumed with dismissing the impossible that she didn't see the danger until it was too late. 3 figures emerged from the darkness, blocking her path. They were big, hulking men, their faces obscured by the darkness and the hoods of their sweatshirts. One of them, the tallest one, held out a hand. "Evening, little lady," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound that sent a jolt of terror through her. "Looks like you've got some nice things for us tonight." Quinn's heart hammered, so hard it felt like it would burst out of her chest. This wasn't a game. This was real. One of the men took a step closer, and the second one, shorter but wider, grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. "Don't even think about screaming," he muttered, his voice a low threat. "Just give us your purse, and we'll leave you alone," the tall one said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. Quinn felt a hot wave of panic rise in her throat. Her purse was all she had. It was her money, her ID, her entire life. She was trapped. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the worst. She had no one to help her. Then, a voice, a deep, resonant rumble she knew better than her own, cut through the night. "Let her go." The men froze and Quinn's eyes snapped open. Standing at the entrance of the alley, a silent, menacing shadow in the darkness, was Damon. His clothes were neat, his posture was relaxed, but his body was radiating an anger so intense it was like a physical heat. His eyes, those warm brown eyes she had fallen in love with, began to change. They were no longer brown. They were a brilliant, searing gold, glowing with a fierce light that was both beautiful and utterly terrifying. The tall man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Look at this joker. You want a piece of us, pretty boy." Damon didn't answer. He simply took a step forward, and the air in the alley went still. With a speed that should have been impossible, he was in front of the tall man. Damon's hand moved in a blur, and a single, sharp punch connected with the man's jaw. The sound was like a car crash. The man's body went limp, and he was sent flying backward, hitting the brick wall with a sickening thud before collapsing in a heap. The other 2 men stared in stunned silence, their bravado gone in an instant. The shorter man, still holding Quinn's arm, pulled a small knife from his pocket. "You're crazy," he snarled, slashing at Damon. The knife blade glinted under the dim streetlight as it connected with Damon's forearm, cutting a deep, ugly gash. Quinn gasped, her heart lurching. The sight of blood always made her feel faint. The man with the knife smiled, a triumphant, sickening grin. "You're not so tough now, are you?" But the grin died on his face. The cut on Damon's arm, which should have been pouring blood, was beginning to close. The skin knitted itself back together as if it were never cut at all. The entire process took less than 5 seconds. Quinn watched in horrified fascination, her mind reeling. The man with the knife stared at the wound, then at Damon's cold, golden eyes, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He dropped the knife and took off, scrambling back the way he came. The third man, who had been watching the whole thing with a look of stunned disbelief, didn't even wait to see what would happen. He ran. Quinn was left alone in the alley with the man she loved and the monster he had just revealed himself to be. The fight was over. The danger was gone. But a new, more terrifying kind of fear had just taken its place. Damon turned to face her, his golden eyes still blazing, his chest heaving with exertion. He took a step toward her, his hand reaching out. "Quinn," he said, his voice hoarse, a silent, painful whisper. The sound of her name was the last straw. The fear, the confusion, the betrayal, it all came crashing down on her at once. She felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. Her mind screamed in protest, refusing to accept what her eyes had just seen. Her legs gave out from under her, and she collapsed, a helpless, broken heap on the cold, hard ground. The last thing she saw was his panicked face as he lunged forward, his golden eyes wide with a desperate fear that was as real as her own. Chapter 5. When Quinn woke up, her mind was a blank slate, but only for a second. The first thing she noticed was the scent of her own apartment, stale coffee and old books, a familiar, comforting smell. The second thing she noticed was the soft morning light filtering through her blinds. She was lying in her own bed, under her own worn quilt. Her clothes from the night before were gone, replaced by an old t-shirt she used for sleeping. The peaceful feeling of being home lasted only a fleeting second before a tidal wave of memory came crashing down on her. The alley, the fear, the men, the glowing golden eyes, the instantaneous healing, the terrible, undeniable truth. Her eyes snapped open and she sat up, her heart a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. She was alone. She swung her legs out of bed, her feet hitting the cool wood floor, her mind screaming. She wasn't safe. She wasn't safe at all. She stood up, her legs wobbly, and stumbled into the living room. Her heart stopped. He was there. Damon was sitting on her couch, his posture slumped, his hands clasped together in his lap. He was fully dressed in the same clothes he had on the night before, and his face was a mask of deep, profound sadness. He looked up, and his eyes, now a normal warm brown, were filled with a raw, honest pain that mirrored her own. "You're awake," he said, his voice quiet, filled with a fragile hope. He started to get up, but she flinched, her body freezing in place. He froze, his hands clenched into fists, a look of anguish crossing his face. The silence that followed was heavy and tense. The memory of the alley came rushing back to her in a terrifying wave. The superhuman strength, the wound that had healed itself. It was all real. Her mind, so used to logic and reason, was screaming in protest, but her heart already knew the truth. "Who are you and what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a small, terrified whisper. He sighed, a sound filled with a deep, crushing weariness. "My name is Damon Reynolds. I'm a werewolf." He said the word as if it were a confession, a painful admission of a secret he had carried his entire life. "I know this is a lot to take in. I know you're scared, but I swear I never meant to hurt you." His words did nothing to soothe her. They only stoked the fire of her betrayal. "You lied to me," she said, her voice rising. "Our entire relationship was a lie. You were watching me, knowing things about me, and you didn't even have the decency to be honest. You let me fall in love with a man who doesn't exist." "Quinn, please," he said, his voice pleading. "It wasn't a lie. Everything I told you, everything I did for you, it was real. I was afraid you would run away if you knew the truth." "You should have been," she said, the pain in her voice sharp as a knife. "Because you're right. I'm leaving, and you're leaving my apartment." She turned and walked to her front door, pulling it open. The morning air was cool on her skin, and for the first time in her life, she felt a profound sense of helplessness. She wasn't running from his house. She was standing her ground, but her ground was now tainted by his presence. She looked at him, and her eyes were filled with a deep, crushing sorrow. "Get out," she said, her voice firm. "Now." He didn't move. He just looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate, heartbreaking anguish that she felt to her very core. She knew he wanted to stay, to fight, to make her understand. But he wasn't going to. He was going to obey her. The man who was once a silent, dominant presence in her life was now a heartbroken boy. With a final, crushing look, he turned and walked out the door, leaving her standing there with her heart pounding in her chest and a new, more terrifying kind of fear. The next day, Damon went to the only place he knew she would be. He walked into the Copper Penny, and his presence filled the room, his eyes scanning the bar, searching for her. He saw her at the other end, her back to him, polishing glasses. He knew she had seen him. She didn't look up, didn't turn around. Barb, her co-worker, gave him a small, sympathetic smile, but Quinn was a fortress. He waited. He ordered his usual sparkling water and sat in his old corner booth, watching her work, hoping she would turn, hoping she would say something. But she never did. She never looked at him. She just worked, her back a straight, impenetrable wall. After 2 hours, he finally gave up, the look on her face a cold, final rejection. But he wasn't done. He couldn't be. The thought of losing her was a physical ache in his chest. A few days later, he went to her apartment. He knocked on the door, his heart in his throat. "Quinn, please, I just want to talk. Please." Silence. He knew she was in there. He could hear the faint sound of a television, the subtle shift in her weight as she moved away from the door. But she wouldn't open it. She wouldn't speak. He knocked again, a little harder this time. "Quinn, please. Just listen to me." Nothing. He finally gave up, the silence a shield against his pleas. He was desperate. He had to make her understand. He went to a small, charming jewelry store and bought a simple, beautiful silver locket, engraved with her initials and a small, delicate wolf. He wrote her a long, heartfelt letter, pouring his soul onto the page, explaining everything, his fears, his love, his longing to make it right. He walked to her apartment, a small, hopeful lump in his throat. He saw a young boy playing in the street and approached him. "Hey there," he said, his voice soft. "I was wondering if you could do me a favor. Can you take this to the girl in apartment 4B? He handed the boy the small, beautifully wrapped gift and a $20 bill. The boy's eyes went wide. "Sure thing, mister," he said, his voice filled with excitement. Damon watched from the car, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw the boy walk up to Quinn's door and knock. He saw her open it. Her face was pale, and her eyes were filled with a deep, tired sadness. The boy handed her the gift, and she looked at it, her expression blank. She didn't open it. She didn't even look at the boy. In a single fluid motion, she took the gift and, without a single thought, simply dropped it into a nearby trash can. Damon's breath hitched. He watched her turn and go back inside, her door clicking shut with a final, heartbreaking sound. The boy walked back to him, a small smile on his face. "She took it, mister." Damon didn't respond. He couldn't. He just stared at the trash can, the little wrapped gift a testament to his broken heart. The simple, decisive act of throwing it away without even looking at it was the most final form of rejection. It wasn't just a gift she had thrown away, it was his hope. It was their future. He had laid his heart bare for her, and she had thrown it in the trash. He started the car, his hands trembling. The barmaid had just rejected the Alpha King, and in that moment, he knew he had a long, lonely road ahead of him. Chapter 6. Some weeks later, life had settled back into a new, quiet kind of agony for Quinn. The hope that Damon had ignited within her had been snuffed out in a cold, brutal blaze. Now she was a person haunted by a memory. The glow of his golden eyes, the sound of a bone-cracking punch, the sight of a wound closing up before her very eyes. Her life was filled with the constant, low-grade thrum of unease. She was back at the Copper Penny, pulling the same levers, wiping down the same sticky bar. The money in her bank account was more than she had ever seen, but she hadn't touched it. It sat there, a testament to his lie, a gift she refused to accept. Her car, the same old beat-up sedan that rattled and coughed, still sat in the parking lot. It was her car, her struggle, and she was not going to give it up. She had been so afraid of her past, so desperately in love with the promise of a future, but now she was a woman who had been betrayed. And she had a terrible, painful, shameful secret. A part of her missed him. A part of her missed the man who had given her hope. She hadn't heard from Damon since she dropped his gift in the trash. The silence had been a relief at first, a space she could use to breathe and pick up the pieces of her broken heart. But as the days bled into weeks, the silence began to feel like a betrayal in its own right. He had given her this impossible new life, a life free from financial stress, only to abandon her in it. The man she thought she knew, the man who was a silent, benevolent presence, had turned out to be a monster. And now, she was left to live with the consequences of his impossible secret all alone. The bell on the bar door chimed, and Quinn looked up, her face a mask of tired indifference. It was the owner, an old man named Mr. Henderson, and his face was a mix of pride and sadness. "Quinn, can you come here for a second?" he asked, his voice filled with a strange new energy. She walked over to him, her heart thumping with a sudden, unbidden dread. She had a bad feeling about this. The regulars were all looking at him with a mix of curiosity and concern. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. "I have an announcement to make," he said, his voice booming. "As of today, the Copper Penny has a new owner." A murmur of shock rippled through the bar. Quinn's mind went blank. The Copper Penny? Sold? It was impossible. This place was his life's work. It was his retirement fund. "I know this is a shock," Mr. Henderson continued, a tear in his eye. "But I have to say I'm happy. I've found a buyer who's going to turn this place into something great." He looked at the door. "He's here now, actually." The door opened, and a figure walked in, his presence so commanding it sucked the air out of the room. He was tall, handsome, and he was the last person on earth Quinn had ever wanted to see again. Damon stood in the doorway, his eyes, those warm brown eyes that still haunted her dreams, scanning the room. He was a perfect portrait of calm, his face giving nothing away. But Quinn could feel the raw power radiating from him, a silent, menacing hum that made her skin crawl. "Everyone, meet the new owner," Mr. Henderson said with a wide, proud smile. Damon Reynolds. Quinn's world went silent. The music, the voices, the laughter, it all faded into a quiet, buzzing hum. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be him. He had bought her bar. He had bought her safe space. The man who had been a quiet, benevolent presence in her life had just revealed himself to be a puppeteer, pulling the strings of her entire life. Her mind reeled with a fresh wave of betrayal. He hadn't just paid her rent, he had bought her. Damon walked toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Quinn," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "I just wanted to say that I hope you'll stay on. This bar needs you." Her voice was a low, dangerous whisper. "You did this," she said, the words heavy with accusation. "I did," he admitted, his eyes filled with a raw, honest pain. "I had to. You wouldn't let me talk to you. You wouldn't let me explain. So I had to find a way to make sure you couldn't run from me." The audacity of his words, the sheer arrogance of it, sent a jolt of pure fury through her. She felt the hot, burning shame of her helplessness rise in her chest. She couldn't quit. She had no job to go to. He had seen to that. He had trapped her. He had taken away her choice. She had been so relieved to get out of the bar, but he had dragged her right back in, this time as his employee. A chillingly cold power dynamic had just been established. The first few days under his ownership were a strange, tense dance. He wasn't a demanding boss. In fact, he was the opposite. He was a silent, watchful presence, always in the corner booth, always ordering the same sparkling water, always watching her. He never yelled, never corrected her, never made her feel like a mistake. He simply watched. It was both a comfort and a terrifying reminder of the secret he held. He started making small, kind changes to the bar. He had the old, sputtering espresso machine replaced with a brand new one. He fixed the broken air conditioner and had the old, sticky floors redone. He even had a small, private office built in the back, a quiet sanctuary where she could hide from the world if she needed to. He never said a word about it. He just did it, a silent, benevolent king building his kingdom around his queen, even as she hated him for it. The humor in their new dynamic came from the small, absurd moments of forced professionalism. "Mr. Reynolds," she would say, her voice stiff with a false politeness, "we're out of limes." He would simply nod, a small, knowing look in his eyes, and a few hours later, a full box of limes would be delivered to the bar. He was her boss, her benefactor, and the man who had shattered her heart. She was in a constant state of internal turmoil. She hated him for what he had done, for the way he had manipulated her life, for the lie he had built their relationship on. But she couldn't deny that her life was better now. She wasn't struggling anymore. She was well rested, well fed, and safe. She was being taken care of. And she had a terrible, shameful secret. A part of her was glad he was there. A part of her was glad he had come back. One night, she was having a particularly terrible shift. A group of loud, obnoxious men were bothering her, making crude jokes and refusing to leave. Quinn, remembering Damon's quiet rage in the alley, felt a wave of fear. She went to tell him about it, her hands trembling. He was sitting in his usual booth, his face a calm, unreadable mask. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice shaking, I think you should ask them to leave." He looked at her, and his eyes held a tenderness so profound it made her want to cry. "I've already handled it," he said simply. He raised his hand slightly, and she saw one of the loud men, a giant of a man, get up and walk to the door, his face pale with a terrified understanding. He simply nodded at Damon and left. The rest of his group followed. It wasn't a confrontation. It was a simple, terrifying show of power. Quinn was left standing there, her jaw slack, her mind reeling. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a threat. He had simply commanded them, and they had obeyed. She looked at him, and her eyes were filled with a new kind of fear. The man she loved was also the man she feared. And in that moment, she realized she was trapped, a princess in a tower of her own making, with a dragon she couldn't outrun. She had a long, lonely road ahead of her, filled with a monster she couldn't outrun. And in that moment, she knew that she had to face him, and she had to make him understand. Chapter 7. The routine of their new life had settled into a quiet, tense existence. Quinn still worked at the Copper Penny, and Damon was still a silent, watchful presence, her boss, a man she was afraid of and ashamed of, and, in her darkest moments, grateful for. The old, familiar sense of financial desperation was gone, replaced by a new kind of anxiety. The feeling of being trapped in a life she didn't choose, a life provided by a man who was both a dream and a nightmare. The days were long, filled with the hum of the new espresso machine and the quiet tension of his presence. She hadn't heard from her best friend Melissa in a while, and the guilt gnawed at her. She had been so caught up in the drama of her own life that she had neglected the one person who had always been there for her. She decided to pay Melissa a surprise visit, hoping a night of bad takeout and a good movie would be enough to patch things up. The drive to Melissa's apartment was filled with a sense of nervous anticipation. The old, familiar comfort of her friendship was a lifeline she was desperate to cling to. As she pulled onto Melissa's street, however, a wave of panic washed over her. The night air was filled with a thick, acrid smell of smoke and the piercing shriek of fire engine sirens. Red and blue lights flashed, painting the street in a frantic, terrifying glow. People were gathered on the sidewalk, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear as they watched the building Melissa lived in. Fire, a living, breathing monster of orange and red, was licking its way up the side of the building, smoke billowing from a third-story window. Quinn's heart seized in her chest. Melissa. She lived on the third floor. Quinn stumbled out of her car, her legs feeling like lead, and ran to the edge of the police tape, her eyes frantically scanning the crowd for her friend. She called Melissa's name, her voice a terrified, useless whisper against the roar of the fire. The firefighters were moving too slow. They were dousing the flames, but the fire was spreading, growing with a terrifying speed. Quinn felt a cold, numbing helplessness wash over her. She couldn't get to her. She couldn't save her. She saw a figure push through the crowd with an alarming ease. He was dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans, but his presence was a storm of quiet command. Damon. He didn't look at her, didn't say a word. He just moved, his eyes locked on the burning building. He didn't push past the police officers. He simply moved with a quiet, otherworldly grace, slipping through the chaos and disappearing into the burning building before anyone even noticed he was gone. Quinn's heart stopped. She watched in horrified fascination as he disappeared into the burning building, a tiny, insignificant human running into the jaws of a monster. She knew what he was doing. She knew why he was there. He wasn't a hero. He was a monster who had just run into a fire. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. The smoke thickened, the sirens wailed, and the shouts of the firefighters became a frantic, desperate chorus. Quinn was numb, her eyes glued to the third-story window, a silent, useless prayer on her lips. She had been so angry at him, so consumed with her own pain, that she had forgotten a fundamental truth about him. He was a protector. He had saved her in an alley, and now he was going to save her friend. Just when she was about to give up hope, a figure emerged from the front door, his body a silent, soot-covered silhouette against the orange glow of the fire. He was carrying a person in his arms, a small, limp figure with a face covered by his shirt. He was moving with a supernatural speed, his steps silent and sure. He didn't look at anyone. He just moved, his body a blur of motion. He got to the sidewalk and gently, carefully, placed the limp figure on the ground. Quinn screamed Melissa's name and ran to them, her body trembling with a fresh wave of panic. Melissa was covered in soot, her face pale, but her eyes were open, a weak, grateful smile on her face. Damon, still silent, was checking her over, his hands moving with an impossible speed and precision, checking her breathing, her pulse, the small cuts and bruises on her arms. He looked up at Quinn, his face covered in soot, his eyes now a dark, bruised brown. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, his body radiating a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He had saved her. He had saved Melissa. He had risked his life for her. The firefighters rushed over and paramedics took over, checking Melissa for burns and smoke inhalation. Quinn was with her, her hands wrapped around her friends, her tears of relief a constant stream. When she finally looked up, Damon was gone. He had disappeared into the chaos, leaving no trace but the small, grateful smile on Melissa's face. Quinn, her heart pounding in her chest, found herself walking away from the fire, toward the alleyway. The scene was still fresh in her mind, a terrible memory that was now mixed with a new, more terrifying one. She found him sitting on the ground, his back against the wall, his head in his hands. He was a picture of pure defeat, his body radiating a profound weariness. He looked up at her, and his eyes, those warm brown eyes she had fallen in love with, were filled with a raw, honest pain that mirrored her own. She sat down next to him, her heart thumping in her chest. She had 1,000 questions, 1,000 accusations she wanted to throw at him, but all she could feel was the warmth of his presence and the quiet, terrible gratitude she felt. He had saved her friend. He had risked everything for a person he didn't even know. He wasn't a monster. He was a hero. Why? She asked, her voice a small, terrified whisper. Why did you do that? He sighed, a sound filled with a deep, crushing weariness. I had to, Quinn. She's your friend. He looked at her, and his eyes held a tenderness so profound it made her want to cry. I can't lose you. Not again. She didn't know what to say. He had laid his heart bare for her, and she had no words to respond. She just sat there, the two of them a small, quiet island of a moment in the middle of a chaotic, terrifying night. She was still afraid. She was still hurt. But for the first time in weeks, she wasn't alone. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt a flicker of hope. And in that moment, she knew that the walls she had built around her heart were not as strong as she had once thought. And in that moment, she knew that she had a choice to make. Chapter 8. The next day, she woke up in her own bed, the morning light a gentle, reassuring presence. The memory of the night before was still fresh in her mind, a terrible memory that was now mixed with a new, more terrifying one. She knew what she had to do. She had to talk to him. She had to know the truth. She got dressed and went to his mansion. The front door opened, and a man she had never seen before looked at her, his eyes filled with a new kind of surprise. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice filled with a new kind of authority. "I need to see Damon," she said, her voice a little shaky. The man looked at her, his eyes filled with a new kind of curiosity. "He's not here," he said, his voice filled with a new kind of kindness. "He's in the woods with his pack." Quinn's mind went blank. The woods. She had a choice to make. She could run, and she could keep her heart safe, or she could stay and she could try to understand. She chose to stay. She walked to the woods, the air filled with the scent of damp earth, and something else, something wild and earthy, like a forest after a storm. She found him sitting on the ground, his back against the wall, his head in his hands. He was a picture of pure defeat, his body radiating a profound weariness. He looked up at her, and his eyes, those warm brown eyes she had fallen in love with, were filled with a raw, honest pain that mirrored her own. "I need to know everything," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper. "I need to know the truth." He sighed, and a small, sad smile touched his lips. "I'll tell you everything," he said, his voice filled with a profound weariness. "But I have to warn you. It's a lot." And he told her everything. He told her about his pack, a secret society of werewolves that lived and worked in plain sight, their existence a well-kept secret from the human world. He told her about his family, a royal bloodline of alphas that had ruled their kingdom for centuries. He told her about his birthright, a title and a power that came with a price. He told her about his wolf, a part of him that was wild and untamed and fiercely protective. He told her about the mating bond, a connection that transcended the ordinary, a sacred bond between two souls that were destined to be together. And he told her about his fear, the terrible, deep-seated fear that if she ever knew the truth, she would run away. Quinn listened in stunned silence, her mind reeling. Everything he had told her was impossible. But in the quiet of her apartment, with the man she loved sitting on her couch, it all made a terrible, beautiful kind of sense. The little things, the unnatural speed, the sudden appearances, the shocking strength, the flash of gold in his eyes. It all came together to form a complete and terrifying picture. But she wasn't afraid. She wasn't terrified. She was just sad. Sad that he had carried the secret for so long. Sad that he had been so afraid. She reached for his hand and held it, her fingers tracing the faded scar on his arm, the wound that had healed itself. He flinched, a small, involuntary reaction to her touch. But he didn't pull away. He just looked at her, his eyes filled with a new kind of fear. "I don't care," she said, her voice a low, steady whisper. "I don't care about the money, the power, the title. I don't care about the wolf." She looked at him, and her eyes were filled with a love so profound it took his breath away. "I just care about you. All of you. The good, the bad, the human, the wolf." He squeezed her hand, his body trembling with a fresh wave of emotion. He had been so afraid to tell her, so afraid to be rejected. But she hadn't rejected him. She had accepted him. She had accepted him for who he was. A quiet, easy smile touched his lips. He leaned in and, with a tender, gentle kiss, he sealed their promise. It was not a kiss of passion, but of a quiet, beautiful understanding. It was a kiss that sealed their love, a promise that this was real, that this was true. He had laid his heart bare for her, and she had accepted it. The barmaid had found her love, a complicated, extraordinary love that was worth fighting for. And the Alpha King had found his queen. And in that moment, he knew that his heart, his wolf, his entire existence was safe with her. He had come home. And that's the end of our story, but the beginning of their new one. Quinn and Damon's journey reminds us that true love isn't about perfection. It's about accepting every part of a person, even the secrets that feel too big to share. If their story touched your heart as much as it did mine, show them some love. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what your favorite moment was. Did you cheer for Quinn when she chose to fight for her happiness? Or were you rooting for Damon as he fought to win back her trust? Let me know what you think. Until next time, my name is Serena, and remember that some loves are worth fighting for.